It's state fair time again. Will the governor and legislature come up with a fair deal for funding education? We talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the weekly program about state government and how it might just affect your life. Joining me this week on Capitol View is Andy Maloney, reporter for Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Welcome, Andy.
Good to be back, Bruce.
And also Charlie Wheeler, director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program at University of Illinois, Springfield.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks to have both of you here. Somewhat where we were last week to an extent. Education funding still up in the air with Senate Bill 1. Today, as we tape, is the day that they were supposed to come up with new money pursuant to the state budget. That money is locked in the state budget until they agree on a bill, Senate Bill 1, that addresses education funding reform. Charlie, can you give us a primer here on exactly why the money can't be freed up and where we're at now in the process?
Yeah, but basically, in sort of an irony, all the time when we had that budget stalemate with most of the state government not having an appropriation, elementary and secondary education has always had a bill authorizing expenditure for money for its programs. Well, this year, that bill says the money for the general state aid, which is the largest pot of money in terms of dollars that goes out to school districts across the state, can't be expended unless it's allocated according to what's called an evidence-based formula. Okay. And currently, the only evidence-based formula that's anywhere near enactment is Senate Bill 1, which the governor rewrote with a mandatory veto, basically to take money away from Chicago, but as sort of collateral damage, she's done a lot of cuts that affect districts throughout the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just preferred. This is my plan. It should be noted, we still don't have an analysis of this, a fiscal analysis of the governor's plan from the Illinois State Board of Education. One development this week was the state board issued a press release saying we can't come up with a plan because, Andy, what?
Yeah, there was a big error, right? There was error getting some of this data or information from Department of Revenue, and I think this plays into the spat that's erupted, and it's been developing for a while, but over how this bill played out, right? Mm-hmm. Because you have Governor Rauner saying for a long time that Democrats refused to send him the bill, Senate Bill 1, which is true. They passed it and then put a procedural hold on it, only releasing it in July. But the Democrats come back and say he wouldn't tell us what he wanted to do with it. We knew that he was against it in principle. He talked all this time about the bill being a bailout for Chicago and how he would want to get rid of that particular aspect of the bill, but he never gave Democrats any particulars, and that's their argument. Now, there's been a lot of I think you could say fumbling from...
That's one F word.
That's one F word. From the administration in terms of sort of rolling this out, because there wasn't, there was no kind of particulars on what this mandatory veto would do, and thus the Board of Education had to wait for those particulars in order to come up with an analysis, and now it's behind.
Should we trust the governor's administration that this was in fact a boo-boo? Because what this had to do apparently was figures having to do with TIF districts, tax increment financing districts, in the Chicago area, and judging from the press releases and what's come out so far, the Department of Revenue, which is under the direct control of the governor, gave bad information to the State Board of Education, which has put a roadblock on coming up with a fiscal analysis. Should we believe the governor, or is this just being obstructionist?
Well, I would say I don't necessarily believe the governor because he's got kind of a spotty track record. But I would not look and say, oh, somebody is sabotaging things within the Department of Revenue. Okay. The people who do these number crunching things aren't political appointments. They're career civil servants. They do the best they can. They're not committed to a Republican governor, a Democratic governor, an independent governor. They really don't operate at that level. Their job is get these numbers, crunch them. What does it mean for individual school districts? Now, there was no reason why Rauner couldn't have said, while the bill was on hold, here are changes I'd like to make. Let's negotiate.
Yeah.
One might argue the reason the Democrats didn't send him the bill was they were keeping it in a position, if there were negotiations, there were an agreement, they could bring the bill back, put the agreement in, and pass it and be done with it. So you could say they were waiting for him to say what he wanted to do, and he didn't. And there's no reason why the governor couldn't say, well, here's what I'm thinking of doing, Department of Revenue. Would you run these numbers and let me know what it's going to look like?
Yeah.
He could have done that whenever. He didn't need the bill to be there. And he could also have had one of his Republican leaders introduce his idea as a piece of legislation. And then again, the state board would have scored it. So I don't look at Rauner as being blameless in this. Maybe inept, maybe the new folks who has in as his main staff.
Well, I mean, the administration at one point earlier on said the governor agrees, and it's become infamous, the governor agrees with 90% of this.
Yeah.
And so I think the prevailing wisdom at that point in time was the part he didn't agree with was what would happen in Chicago. He felt it was going to be a bailout for Chicago schools. Now, as more information comes out about this mandatory veto and what's really in there, it's appearing like downstate districts, a significant number of them, would face reductions in their funding. Why would the governor, I mean, he's long been the rest of the state versus Chicago sort of guy. You know, that's what his reputation is. Why would he introduce something like this that could harm districts in downstate?
I don't really see the wisdom of it myself,
Okay.
and I suppose to be charitable, he doesn't understand it. There was stuff in there that had been discussed but never embodied in legislation before. Two things in particular that hurt many downstate districts. And they have to do with how do you count a district's tax base? Because this general state aid, the formula that exists, takes into account how wealthy is a local district, how much money can they raise on their own, and it's structured so that districts that can't do that much on their own get more money from the state.
Going forward.
Yeah, each year.
Yeah, right.
And the problem is that in many communities across the state, not just Chicago, there is some real estate that's tied up in what are called tax increment financing districts, or TIFs.
Including here in Springfield.
Yeah, there's several in Springfield. And for purposes of calculating how much local wealth is available to a school district, as things stand now, that TIF property is not counted as what's taxable because in reality it can't be taxed.
And that's under the governor's preferred.
Yeah,
vision,
well, and the other one is something called an adjustment for the tax cap law, the property tax extension limitation law. And what that does is it says to a local district, all school districts, many cities and most counties, and all special units, you can only ask for additional money next year from property taxpayers that is not greater than the rate of inflation. And so if your home values rise dramatically or your property rises dramatically, you can't access that with your real estate levy, the amount you're asking for, because of the tax caps.
Okay.
And so that's something that exists in all the collar counties, in Cook County, and roughly a third of the downstate counties, including Sangamon County. So our local governments, not the city, but everybody else, is limited, and say property values go up by 20%, the levy can only increase by whatever the rate of inflation is.
3% or whatever.
Yeah, and the current formula takes that into account and says, well, on paper, it says you have $100 million worth of taxable property. In reality, because of caps, you can only access maybe 95 million of it. So in terms of figuring out what you're entitled to in state aid, will only count as your wealth that amount of real estate that you can actually access. Now, Rauner wants to do away with both of these things, the TIF exemption and the PTEL adjustment. And his argument is, well, this is local people choose to do this. And I would say, again, he's either misinformed or ignores history. Tax caps were enacted in 1991. They were a big campaign platform plank for Jim Edgar when he ran for governor. And it was predicated upon tax-based values, local property wealth roughly doubling in the collar counties in the prior decade. And so they wanted to cap it. And then about 10 years later, the realization came that some of these school districts, the state is looking at them and say, oh, you have all this property wealth, but in reality they can't access it because of the tax cap. And so there was adjustment. And another irony, the adjustment was pushed by suburban Republicans and it was signed by George Ryan in, I believe, 1999, because suburban school districts were really hurting on account of this. So now the state looks at what's your local property tax base. We won't count what's in a TIF district. We won't count that portion you can't access because of the tax caps. We'll only count that portion that you can actually use to support your schools or local governments, and that's what we'll use for the state aid formula.
And at the end of the day, the result, as I understand this, is it ignores what quote-unquote fair market value is of the property within a given district.
Well, it basically pretends as though a school district is wealthier in terms of a tax base than in reality it is in terms of what it can tax.
And that's something that Governor Rauner has, I think that's part of this whole Chicago versus everyone else dichotomy is the governor and I think his surrogates or his supporters would say just generally that that's something that happens in places like Chicago where maybe their property value isn't as, or they've got more value there than they're really letting on. They've got more wealth there than they're letting on. But I think when you talk about, so this amendatory veto actually also doing some damage downstate, I think it's interesting politically because we saw this week some superintendents from a handful of districts come forward and say, this is
nowhere near Chicago districts.
Right, this is going to hurt. I think it gets back to the governor, since he started running for the office. Basically, he's been a campaign guy, sort of a big ideas guy, not sort of into kind of the analysis and trying to describe all of the details of legislation like this. And I think as long as he hammers on his message that Chicago's going to benefit, nobody else is. He believes that's a winning formula, regardless of whether he understands those fine points or not. It's part of the strategy for him, I think.
I mean, it seems as if the governor's preferred method goes forward and is accepted, and that's a long if on that one, it would seem like the state would be spending less money on education in toto than it otherwise would. Is that a fair assumption, do you think, or is it just splitting the pie up differently?
I guess it would depend on what ultimately happens and I say that because the formula also has provisions in it so that if there's not enough money that every school district gets what it's entitled to under this complicated equation, then everything gets prorated. And it's been like that up until the last couple of years. It was down as low as 89%, 89 cents on the dollar. And so if Senate Bill 1 passes, his veto is overridden, or if it's accepted, then everything within there is contingent. There's contingency. It's contingent upon the money being appropriated. So I, as a school superintendent, might say, oh, under Senate Bill 1 or under the amendatory veto, I'm entitled to X. And all the other school superintendents would say, we're entitled to X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and so on. You add it all up, and if the dollars, the lump sum for that purpose is not appropriated by the General Assembly, then everybody gets reduced. So it's hard to say whether the state would actually save money because the need is out there. There's legislation that suggests the state should meet a certain level. Well, not legislation. Well, there's in the legislation covering general state aid, it says $6,119 per student is how much should be available to educate every kid across the state. That number has not been reached in recent years, and the group of experts who come up with this number and revise it every couple of years, last time they revised it, it said it should be north of $8,000 per kid. So you could say that arguably we're going to continue to need to appropriate more dollars. And in fact, the Governor's Commission, what did they calculate it at, like $3 billion more?
Something like that.
For general state aid to meet their recommendations. So it's been an ongoing problem. You know, at the start of the show, you mentioned how we're going to be talking again about school funding this week. And I'm thinking to myself, I first got involved with this back at ConCon in 1970 when this was a big issue then.
Yeah.
So go figure.
Well, sure. I mean, education funding is a big issue for most states. I mean, Illinois is not necessarily alone, but we seem to be.
Worst.
Well, yeah, exactly. We do seem to be on one end of the extreme in at least one respect, which is our funding formula for education is widely acknowledged to be the most unfair, most inequitable of the 50 states. So what we've got here is, it seems to me, there's a number of options. The mandatory veto can be overridden. Doesn't seem like it's gonna it seems like that's gonna happen in the Senate. I was at a press conference this morning with Andy Maloney, and he as much as said, so we're going to override in the Senate, and they're set to have a convene on Sunday, likely to do exactly that. The House is the big question. And so the prevailing wisdom as we sit now is that there aren't enough votes in the House to override. And so if there's not enough votes in the House to override, can the money be released in general? Is that evidence-based formula still intact enough that the money can be released?
No, until there is some statute that it contains the elements of an evidence-based formula, something that's been passed by both chambers, signed by the governor, or his veto has been overridden, or an mandatory veto accepted. There's no authority for the State Board of Education to cut the checks or to send the vouchers to the comptroller to cut the checks for all the local school districts, 800 some across the state.
So doing nothing is not a real option for the legislature at this point in time with the mandatory veto?
One would hope not.
Okay.
But on the other hand, if you would have asked me like 3 years ago, is it a real option for the legislature and the governor not to enact the budget? And I'd say, oh, of course not.
Right. And
Is that silly constitutional?
And I think I think that's a great point, because it's worth realizing and sort of backing up and saying this progression that we've made in the last 3 years from this viewpoint where, no, that can't happen. A budget has to be approved. And what would happen if it didn't, to 2.5 years later? I mean, even during that impasse, the school funding, getting money to schools, was sort of the thing that was seen as too radioactive not to do.
A sacred cow.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, Governor Rauner signed, remember, that was the one sort of portion of the budget that he signed into law, is we're still going to fund schools. So to get to a point where it becomes this close to reality of not doing that, and then seeing what happens, just rolling the dice afterward, is pretty remarkable, I think.
Well, the governor does not seem to be in a negotiating stance right now in terms of the issues that are important to the Democrats in the General Assembly. I mean, it could never happen, of course, maybe a lawsuit. Is that something that someone could possibly pull out of their hat?
Well, I would say, and Andy's more an expert on this stuff than I am.
You're right.
Anybody can file
Counselor?
a lawsuit for whatever reason
Sure.
at any time, as long as they pay the filing fee, correct?
Correct.
Whether or
Absolutely.
not it'll get anywhere, that's a whole different question.
Well, I mean, we kept the state going with absent a budget predicated largely on lawsuits and injunctions.
And there are lawsuits out there that talk about equitable funding, and there's at least a couple of them, one in Chicago, one in downstate. I'm not sure, though, that you could get them to compel funding right away. They're at certain junctures where they're making some other claims, not necessarily we need money right now. Somebody else would have to come along and try and make the claim that something in the Constitution or something in statute compels this money to be released right away, before we see a situation, I think, like the social service providers during the impasse, or state workers during the impasse.
Sure. I mean, again, at this morning's press conference, I don't want to focus too much on it, but one of my takeaways was, again, Senator Menard was there, Representative Shearer was there. There was a group of I guess, teachers, parents, a group of community members. The loudest applause came, and most cheers came, when Andy Maloney said, collective bargaining for teachers is not part of this. We're not going to go there. And so that made me wonder, is that part of this? Is this something, at least from the governor's side? Is this something that we haven't heard about? I mean, again, I was taken by just what a strong response came up when that issue was broached. Is this any possibility?
Well, go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was waiting for you. Because I'll weigh in later.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, we saw the budget process end with, I think it was widely believed that even though the governor could arguably benefit from, having increased tax revenue, but saying he didn't want the tax, and starting to patch some of the holes that were left during the last 2.5 years. He didn't get any kind of workers' compensation reform. He didn't get any of those turnaround agenda items that he wanted in that deal, right? So I think it's totally possible that that's still nagging, and for his surrogates as well in the legislature, Republicans worked on those issues for a long time and ended up with none of them but a tax increase and a budget that was set on legislative Democrats' terms. So
could we then throw them a turnaround agenda item? I mean, they were fairly close, supposedly. Workman's comp was the furthest down the rails. What if we throw in workman's comp? Will he then?
Well, see, I think workers' compensation changes were probably the most amenable to negotiation if you had two sides who were seriously committed to getting something done. You look at what Senate President Cullerton, former Republican leader Christine Radogno did over the Christmas break. They sat down and they did some hard negotiations. They came up with a package of bills that were pretty reasonable. And they started to move through the Senate, and the governor put the kibosh on it. And I think his attitude was, well, this is not all that I want. And it goes back to what you said earlier, where his so-called education secretary said, well, he's getting 90%, but it's not good enough. And I'm thinking to myself, how many pals in the history of Illinois would have said, 90%? Oh, thank you, Lord. I never would have imagined
Thank you, Santa
it.
Claus.
Yeah. And it's Governor Rauner, for whatever reason, is having a difficult time adjusting to the fact that he is not the head of the corporate Illinois who tells people what to do. Rauner can't look at Madigan and Cullerton and say, hey, I want this, you do it. They're co-equal.
How much might this hurt him come election time? I say this in part because Representative Barbara Wheeler has announced that she is not considered perhaps the most liberal member of the legislature, but she has announced that she is not going to seek another term. And during an interview with Chicago area media, she said some things about Rauner which kind of at least raised my eyebrows. One, she said, I don't think any of his reforms will go through. And she also said that he's going to face some tough sledding come re-election time in the face of what she predicts to be a fairly strong year for Democrats nationwide. Now he's got some folks downstate in school districts scratching their heads, wondering what's going on here with district funding. He's got, I think, 6 now Republican legislators who have announced that they're not going to return. Is this going to be easier for Rauner going forward, or is it going to get more difficult in terms of governing?
If I were advising him, I would tell him to stop focusing on what he can't get, and there's no way in God's green earth that he can get, namely weakening collective bargaining. That ain't going to happen. And focus on what he's done. He signed a bill the other day that made significant changes in the procurement code, which is dull as dust.
Sure.
Nobody wants to hear about the procurement code.
Yeah.
But there were very strict regulations, a lot of red tape put in the wake of Rod Blagojevich, and it really was throttling the ability to go out and actually get a bargain for the state.
It's dry unless you're running an agency and trying to get stuff done.
Yeah, or a university and have to jump through 72 hoops before you can buy a pencil. And so this reformed those over burdensome regulations to make it more reasonable. And he signed it. Now that's something that was part of his turnaround agenda, and he could claim, I did this. We signed a bill the other day that when you're released from prison, you get a copy of your birth certificate so you can get a job. That's all positive stuff. But he tends to be obsessed with this notion of, I got to punish the Chicago Teachers Union, and it's all Mike Madigan's fault.
Yeah, and I mean, we've talked about this recently before with his staff shakeup. I mean, he's got folks now, his chief of staff comes from a think tank, which put forth a budget saying, we don't have to raise taxes at all. We can have a budget for Illinois that has no tax increases whatsoever, and so no tax increases, period, which countervails, I think, the kind of the prevailing thought that Illinois is in such a deep fiscal hole that there's no other way. Does he become? Is he become more ideological going forward, or less so? I mean, where's the pragmatism? I'm asking, I guess.
Yeah, it's a fair question, because I think when he did have the shakeup, we came here and we talked all about what this meant for. Was he, arguably he's been in campaign mode for a long time,
Sure.
but was he making an even harder shift in that vein and just going all out with the anti-tax, anti-Speaker Madigan and Chicago Democrats agenda? I think that's a fair assumption. Like Charlie said, I mean, there's been some pushing that he's done on something like criminal justice that is not an easy issue, and that a lot of Democrats agree with him on. But he has not gone out of his way to highlight that. I said it last time, but I think he's got that tune in his ear, right? It's Speaker Madigan. He can use that ticket into 2018, and he knows that people in the state don't have a very favorable view of the Speaker. They might not have a favorable view of him, but if he can keep playing that card, I think he thinks it'll be a success in 2018.
Yeah. And just I guess this week he announced his new point person in Washington D.C., Sam Pfister. I hope I pronounced that correctly. This is a fairly young gentleman in his early 30s. But 5 years ago, I believe it was, he stood up at a rally at the Capitol and said, it was kind of a Tea Party-esque sort of thing, and said we used to have no taxation without representation. Now we have gross taxation with misrepresentation. I mean, this seems like almost a playbook from the Trump sort of school of thought, drain the swamp, that sort of thing. And this is now the person who Rauner has picked to be his contact in Washington, D.C. What does that portend?
I think it shows anti-Washington, anti-establishment plays well in the establishment and in Washington too. You can look at who's in the Oval Office, President Trump. Nobody thought he was going to make it to the White House, but lo and behold, that message really played with a lot of people. And I don't doubt that Governor Rauner and some other folks around the country were watching closely, even if they didn't want to say his name necessarily.
And with that, we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next week on Capitol View.